Hi, my name is Keith Kondrich, and I'm the Executive Director for the Society of St. Vincent de Paul here in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. And for today's Monday meditation, I want to talk about wheat and I want to talk about weeds. And to get us started, let me share the parable of the wheat and the weeds from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. Jesus proposed another parable to the crowd, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a man who sowed good seed in his field. While everyone was asleep, his enemy came and sowed weeds all through the wheat, and then went off. When the crop grew and bore fruit, the weeds appeared as well. The slaves of the householder came to him and said, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where have the weeds come from?' He answered, 'An enemy has done this.' His slave said to him, 'Do you want us to go and pull them up?' He replied, 'No. If you pull up the weeds, you might uproot the wheat along with them. Let them grow together until harvest. Then at harvest time, I will say to the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles for burning, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" My first apartment when I got out of college was in the Oakland neighborhood of Pittsburgh. And it was a really great setup because I was close to all the art and culture, the museums, the music scene. You know, it was a young man's dream pad. And the best part of it was I didn't have to pay any rent. The woman that had the apartment gave it to me in exchange for doing household chores like cutting her grass, shoveling her snow. And once a week she would put a list on my door of all the things that she wanted me to get done that week. Early on in my stay at the apartment, my landlady gave me a list, and it included weeding her garden. And so I went out and with reckless abandon, I started to weed. I tore up everything in the garden. I had a rake and a hoe and clippers, and I did a fantastic job, 3 or 4 hours of hard labor, and I had that garden as clean as a whistle, beautiful, just flat, level soil, all uprooted, all the weeds thrown away in the trash. I was really proud of myself. Until there came a knock on my door. And my landlady said, "Mr. Kondrich, what have you done?" And I said, "I weeded your garden like you asked me to." And she said, "Weeded my garden? Weeded my garden? Oh my goodness, you tore up all of my beautiful rare plants. You threw them out with the weeds." Well, of course, our relationship got off to a rocky start there, but the lesson was that in my desire to have a clean and perfect looking garden, I had failed to distinguish between the weeds and the beautiful plants that my landlady had there for many, many years. And so the gospel parable that I shared with you relates to my weeding frenzy, if you will. Because often today, we think that we can distinguish the wheat from the weeds. We think that we know who the weeds are out there in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our society, in the world. And how do we know who they are? Well, we know who the weeds are by the way they speak or the language that they use. We know who the weeds are by the way they dress. We know who the weeds are by what political party they're affiliated with. We know who the weeds are by their sexual orientation. And so we know, right? We know who the weeds are in our neighborhoods, in our society, in our nation, and in our world. And we do our self-righteous best to uproot those weeds, to make sure that those weeds are not living among us, that those weeds aren't somehow choking out what we consider to be the perfect wheat. It's not our job to go on weeding frenzies to uproot those people, to somehow disparage or alienate or ostracize or somehow judge those people around us that we consider weeds. Because my friends, none of us have the full picture. So whenever I feel like doing a little weeding, whenever I feel judgmental towards the people around me, I like to stop and I like to think about St. Paul. Remember who St. Paul was before he became that great apostle. St. Paul was known as Saul of Tarsus, and Saul's job was to weed out Christians. His job was to persecute, his job was to imprison, his job was to kill those people who were following Jesus Christ. And he did that with great enthusiasm. The early Christian community probably thought Paul was the weed. He was probably thought of as someone that needed to be uprooted himself. And so that brings us back to the parable. Because if the early Christian community would have weeded out Saul of Tarsus, if they would have somehow gotten rid of him, we would never have known that great apostle, whose writings and whose travels spread the faith throughout the world, who continues to inspire and enliven and encourage and challenge us as Christians to embrace and to love and to live the message of Jesus Christ. And so, my friends, I ask you to think about this during the upcoming week. If God could take a weed like Saul of Tarsus and turn him into the wheat that became St. Paul, think about what he can do with the weeds in your life. Think about all of the miracles that God the harvester is working with the weeds around us right now. Our job is to sow the seeds. Our job is not to harvest. That's God's job. And only God sees the whole picture. God bless you and have a great week.